In this video, we're going to talk about NanoMesh. NanoMesh is a method of instancing meshes inside of ZBrush that utilizes the insert multi-mesh brushes and then instances a single Z tool across multiple polygon faces. It grew out of MicroMesh, which was an older tool inside of ZBrush where you could take a single mesh and then replace polygons with that mesh. And then we also have MicroPoly, which is new in ZBrush 2021, which is found under dynamic subdivisions, which we use often with cloth to create things like weave and things like that. Now, NanoMesh allows us to instance an insert multi-mesh across multiple faces, and then control the parameters of each one of those instances. So just to show what this looks like in the most basic terms, I have a polygon sphere on screen. If we go into frame mode, I'll step down to the lowest subdivision level, and I actually want this a little lower, so I'm going to click Reconstruct Subdiv. And as long as the mesh polygon count can be divided by 4, that will create a lower subdivision level. I'll delete my higher levels because NanoMesh requires that the mesh only have one subdivision level. Now we'll go to B for brush, I for insert, and we'll go to one of our IMM brushes. In this case, we'll go to machine parts. And let's grab, for example, this dial here. If I select the dial, the recess dial, and then I click and drag, it draws that insert multi-mesh onto the surface. Now, as you know, or may not know, this does not create a separate subtool. This just inserts this mesh into the existing subtool. Now, what NanoMesh does is if I go to the brush menu and go to Create and select Create NanoMesh Brush, now it'll switch me over to the Z Modeler tool. And now it doesn't appear that anything has changed. I still have my insert multi-meshes up here, but now I can insert them using NanoMesh. So what it does is it draws and then polygroups the polygon that it drew onto. Now, Z Modeler is contextual based in terms of a brush. So if I mouse over a face and press the space bar, I have my options for a face. If I mouse over an edge, I get my options for an edge. And we have a whole video just on Z Modeler, but NanoMesh is a tool that's rolled into Z Modeler, so we're just going to talk about NanoMesh right now. If I mouse over a face and press the space bar, you see that we're set to insert NanoMesh. Now, my target is a single poly, but I want to do all polygons, so I'll click Polygroup All, or I can click All Polygons. Click and drag, and that will draw that insert mesh on every polygon. Now, to access my NanoMesh settings, I go to the Tool menu and then open up NanoMesh. And here I can see my NanoMesh settings. I can turn NanoMesh on and off here. I could copy this NanoMesh and then paste it, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. If I click Edit Mesh, I can edit my original model. So you see, this allows me to come in here and make changes to the original model, and it brings me into split screen mode. So as I make changes to this, you see it updates on the NanoMesh. I'll undo those changes and then turn off Edit Mesh. Now I can change size, and that changes the global size for all of these instances. I can change the width. I can change the length. I can even change the height. Now, what's really nice about NanoMesh is I can add variation to these. So I can add variation to length, width, and height, and that starts to give me some randomness in these shapes. Now, they're all kind of pointing the same direction. So if I come over here and change my X offset, Y offset, Z offset, I can make some of them sink down deeper into the surface than others, and then I can add variation to that so they're not all at the same depth. I could also change my rotation. So if I want to change my rotation around Y or X or Z, I can do that and then add variation to that. Now, currently it's showing the polygon placement. It shows me the polygons these are growing out of. If I turn off Show Placement, I will only see my NanoMesh. Now, these are not all different pieces of geometry. If I go into frame mode, Shift F, you see it's not showing up as actual polymesh. These are instances. These are copies that exist in memory. They don't exist as actual geometry yet. I could further change things by flipping them in horizontal or vertical. We can also tile them. So I can tile them along the horizontal. So let's do tile 4 by 4. And we can further tile them on each face. We also have the option to change patterns here. So if I change my pattern selection, Here I can do corners inset. I can also just directly select, do a border, for example. So each polygon gets a border of these NanoMesh inserts. And again, these don't exist yet as geometry. And as long as we're staying in ZBrush, they can remain as instances. However, there's many times that we want to turn this into actual geometry. So what we would do is we would come down to Inventory and click One to Mesh. And then that converts that to an actual set of polygons. You see the NanoMesh settings go away. And if I Control-Shift-Click on one of the polygroups, I can hide the polymeshes they grew out of, the polygons. If I invert my visibility, you see the sphere there. And then I can simply go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. And then I only have those insert meshes that were nanomeshed as new geometry. So that's NanoMesh in a nutshell. Let's take a look at other ways that we can utilize this. These tools that I'm going to be using are available for you in the downloads for this video, so you can actually follow along if you like. So here I've loaded the Room Base Z tool. There are 3 subtools here. There is a floor. If we go into frame mode, you can see the floor. There is a wall, and then there is a wall with a window aperture. And there is a polygroup around the aperture for the window. So we'll start with the floor. I want to load up a specific insert multi-mesh brush that's not part of our default brush menu. That's the IMM Clods. If I go to Lightbox, and in the Lightbox go to the brush menu, go to IMM, we can now find IMM Clods here. And this is just an insert mesh brush for sort of dirt clods or rocks. Select any one of these that you think would fit for a floor flagstone, and then go to Brush, Create NanoMesh Brush. Click OK. Mouse over a face and press the space bar. We're set to Insert NanoMesh, and we'll do Polygroup Island. Click and drag, and that will draw those instances on that Polygroup Island. Now we'll go to Tool, NanoMesh. Let's change our height, so we'll bring the height down. Maybe change the size a little bit. Zoom in so we get a better look here. Now I want to change my rotation around the Z axis. Right now we've got a -73. If I bring randomness into that, I can randomize that pattern. And we can change our sizing like this and bring our height down so they're a little bit flat, like flagstones. Now I could also change my Z offset. If I change the Z offset, maybe bring those down into the ground plane just a little bit and then add some variation to that, we can have a little bit of an uneven floor plane like this. Now this is a nice tip. If you click clip, it will clip the border where the polygon ends that those are growing out of. And that's a really nice way to make kind of a clean base for maybe a 3D print or a figure. Now I can also bring up my tiling. I can tile it, let's say 3 by 3. And you see that increases the number of tiles here. I can change my size again. We can turn these up. And if I turn off show placement, then I won't see the plane that it's actually growing out of. And that's just the show placement slider, or the show placement button here. If I bring my tiling back down, set this to maybe 2 by 2, not 22, there we go, 2 by 2, you can see it updates on the geometry itself. Now I could also just make this a random distribution. If I use the random distribution slider, I can just randomly distribute these all over the floor plane like this. Now that can very quickly become rather heavy, even though these are instances. So it can start to eat up some of your resources. So just be aware of that. I'll set this back down to the lowest setting. And I'll bring these back down to 1 by 1. And once we have the tiling set to 1 by 1, our pattern immediately defaults back to 0. So let's say that we want to add a different insert mesh brush here. I can select a different clod. And then under Inventory, we can press the button, Replace NanoMesh from Brush, and that will replace whatever NanoMesh is there from whatever is selected from my Insert Multi-Mesh brush. And I could do that from any brush. I could select an entirely different IMM brush, for example, Bolt Head, I could select this and then replace from brush, and it would replace it with the bolt heads. So it doesn't have to be another brush that we have turned into an insert NanoMesh brush. So if we're happy with this, we can leave it as it is, or if we want to turn this into an actual mesh, I could click 1 to mesh, and that bakes that down to actual geometry. So this is now actual polygon geometry. I could go in here and let's just add a little bit of color to it. We'll do RGB, color fill object. There you go. That's actually polygon geometry. I might lighten that color a little bit. So let's bring this up a tad and then go to color fill object. There we go. So let's try something similar, but this time on the wall here. I'll select the wall subtool. Alt click on that, go into frame mode. So you can see there is our wall. Now let's put some bricks on here. So what I will do is I will go back to my light box. Under brushes, IMM, I will select IMM bricks. That loads up the brick brush. Go to brush, create NanoMesh brush, press the space bar, polygroup island. Click and drag. Now it's giving me an error because I have subdivision levels on here, so I go to geometry, delete lower. Now when I click and drag, it will draw those bricks out. So let's go back to our NanoMesh menu. So we've drawn our initial bricks. We'll go to the NanoMesh settings here, and I'm going to go ahead and solo this so we're only seeing this particular panel. We don't have to see the rest of the room. So this is a nice opportunity to work with our pattern options. So let's go ahead and make this 4x4. And then if I change my pattern to, let's say, checker odd, you see that we can actually change out the different types of patterning that we get. We can go to corners. We can get these in the corners. And if I increase this to 6x6, and then change our pattern with the slider, you can watch that patterning update. I'm going to change this back down to 1x2. And let's go ahead and dial our sizing up. And we can go ahead and do things like corners, for example, and that will give us corners on here. But we have 1x2, so that's not going to really be visible, so we need to do it 2x2. We'll dial our sizing back down. And there you go, you see what we can end up getting. I can rotate this around Z. So if I rotate it like this, we can change the positioning of these. Now, obviously, these are going to be all the same orientation, which isn't necessarily what we want at this stage, but we can always introduce randomization to that. I'll set this to 0, so we get them at a nice 90 degree. And let's try some of our others here. We do a border or a grid inset, and we'll set this to 4x4. Let's do 8x8. And let's increase our tiling. Let's bring the tiling back down to, let's say, oops, we don't want to go that far. 4x2. There we go. Now, again, I could randomize this entirely just with a random distribution, but for something like a brick wall, it's probably not what we want. So what I would do is just come back to these and set our tiling to 1x1, and make sure that our random distribution is turned down. And then I will go to my sizing, and let's turn the sizing up. And I will go to my Z, let's do X offset. There we go. And then I will add variation to the X offset, so some of them will be at a different offset than others. Maybe add a little bit of variation in the Y offset. And let's do Z rotation. And and give some variation to that. Now, this may or may not be something that we want. We probably want to give a little bit of a subtlety to that so we don't have them all going diagonally. So let's just go ahead and bring this Z rotation down a little bit. There we go. So we can just add a little bit of sort of noise to that rotation there so it's not all the same. Now let's change things like our length. The length is actually going to read as the height. So let's go ahead and change the height. Now that's going to read as the depth. Sometimes you can lose your bearings if you're not careful. There we go. It's the width that we want. So we'll turn the width down and then add variation to the width. And that's going to give us further randomness in that wall. And of course, we can clip the edges just like that. And that's going to give us just the area that's encompassed by the polygons from which it's growing. If I turn off show placement, it will turn off the actual surface from which those are growing. And let's go ahead and see about changing no, not the length. I think that's going to be the width. Nope, not the width. Let me undo that. It was the height. There we go. I want these to be shallower, so they're more like the flagstones on the floor. There we go. Turn off solo. So now we've got a floor, and we have a wall of bricks. So this is pretty neat. If I were to copy this particular NanoMesh instance, let's go over to this Z tool here, the one with the window. Make sure we don't have any subtools, and I'm going to press the space bar. We're going to insert NanoMesh, Polygroup Island. Click and drag, and then that will draw the instances on that island. But watch, because I copied my previous NanoMesh, I liked those settings, I can paste them. So I paste that in here, and it pastes the exact same settings that we had for this wall. Now I can adjust it so the scale works better, so it matches up a little bit better just by going to my size control here, and I can turn that size up. And we can adjust our height, like so. And I will make sure that show placement is turned off. And I think I would like this to give me a little bit less of an overhang right here. So I will go to Z offset, and let's sink this down into the wall a little bit more to about this point here. Now I'm going to take another brick. I'm going to mouse over this polygroup here, and I will press the space bar, and I've got Polygroup Island. I will go ahead and click and drag, and that will draw these bricks into that Polygroup Island. Now, if I go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Align Edge, that will align all the faces on that particular polygon plane. So you see what just happened there. I'm going to undo that. Under Geometry, Modify Topology, Align Edge. Right now, everything's sort of random. If I click Align Edge, it will make sure all the edges point in the same direction, which will give us a little bit better result on this particular insert. So now, if I go to my sizing, turn my size up, we get this nice sort of flagstone, or not flagstone, a sort of arch, proscenium arch kind of window. Once again, I can clip that, and that gives me a much better result for that window there. Now I can go here. You see I've got this index now. I've got index 1. Index 0 is the wall itself. So I can do index 1, and I can bring variation into the Z depth on just those. See, as I change that, it's only affecting the wall. If I go to index 1, that is reflected in the NanoMesh here. I can also click this icon and select them directly. Any changes that I make now will be reflected in the window panes or in the window ledge. So I can take my Z offset, bring this back deeper into the wall or further out, as it were. So this allows us to very easily create complex sort of environmental models using a single insert mesh brush that we can then distribute across a surface. Now, we're not limited to just doing things like bricks and stones. We can also do things like scales and scale texture. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. I just want to mention these menus down here. We have alignment. So the alignment allows us to change if it's aligned to normal. If you watch the bricks here around the window, we can align to the short edge of the faces. We can align to the long edge, the near edge, by point order, or to random edges. So this allows you to change the alignment settings. We also have colorize, so you can use the base mRGB. You could use the mesh color or the mesh material. You can also adjust the hues and saturation and intensity if you are picking up a color from the model underneath. So if we pick up mesh mRGB, that's picking up the poly paint there. Let's zoom into that so you can actually see it. And then if I scroll down here, I can adjust the hue, intensity. Let's turn this down to 0. 0. And let's go to our bricks here. There we go. And then we can adjust the hue. Saturation. We also have UV here. We also have UV, which allows us to use the base mesh UVs. So it is possible to have texture on top of these NanoMesh inserts. Now, inventory, I can say 1 to mesh, and that will convert this instance into actual physical geometry, as we've seen before. We could also turn them all into a brush. So I could click all to brush, and then I'd have a brush that inserts essentially a brick wall. So if I click all to brush, I could have them all as a brick brush now. You can delete one instance or one stage from your NanoMesh. So if I were to go up here and then click delete one, I could delete the window frame. If I delete all, it will delete all of them. So let's take a look now at how we can use this to add scales along the length of a serpent's body. So now I've opened up a Z tool that's also available for you to download. This is just a section of tail I created using Z-sphere modeling. There is polygrouping along each section. I've also loaded up this Z tool, which is a selection of scales. You see there's 3 different scales here. Now these are quite dense. There's 333,000 faces, or 393,000 faces on this one, 98,000 on this one, and 561 on this one. So these have a fair bit of detail on them, as well as poly paint. So what I need to do is create an insert multi-mesh brush from these scales. So the first thing I want to do is actually decimate them. So I'll open up the Z plugin menu, and I will open up Decimation Master. Now we have a whole chapter just on Decimation Master, but in a nutshell, Decimation Master will allow me to reduce the overall poly count while keeping my poly paint and keeping the appearance of high detail. Now, we go into this in much more detail in our chapter on Decimation Master, but basically, because we are going to be instancing these scales across multiple faces, we're going to exponentially increase the number of scales, which can exponentially increase the number of polygons. So the lower resolution and the higher quality appearance we have in our insert mesh brush, the better. So I will click Pre-Process All, and that will pre-process each one of those subtools. It will write a cache file. See, it's processing it now. It just writes a cache file to disk. If at any point this plugin behaves unexpectedly for you, it doesn't do what you think it should do, there's a button down here called Delete Caches. Just delete the caches and then reprocess your subtools. So it'll step through each one of these scales, process each one of them, and just write a cache file that we can use to decimate. So there we go. Now we're ready to start decimating. I'll go to the top subtool. It is currently 300,000 faces. It's 393,000 faces. And this slider here, K polys, this is the target polygon count in thousands of polygons. So let's set this to 5,000 polygons. Decimate current. And you see we lose our poly paint. So what we have to do is make sure that we use and keep polypaint before we do our decimation. That includes the pre-processing. So if you don't have this turned on, your polypaint will go away. So all I need to do is just pre-process all again. Now I can set it to 5,000 faces and decimate current, and it will decimate and maintain my polypaint. So you see it's come down to 2,500 faces now. It's lost a fair bit of detail, but we're also going to have these quite small. So you can split the difference, as it were, between your level of detail and the resolution that you want to maintain. So if I decimate current at 10,000, we keep a little bit more detail. Now I can switch to the next. We can set this to, let's set this to 20,000 so you can see the difference. We'll decimate current, and that appears to not lose any detail, but if we go into frame mode, you can see it has actually significantly reduced the overall polygon count. If I redo that, you see it's triangulated the surface, keeping small triangles in areas of high detail and large triangles in areas of less detail. If we go to our last one here, we'll set this. This is 560,000. We'll set it to 30,000, decimate current, and this maintains all that polypaint and the detail. So now we have 3 decimated subtools for 3 different types of scale. I will go to Brush, Create, Insert Multi-Mesh, and that creates an Insert Multi-Mesh brush based on each one of those scales. So now I can insert those scales, and I will save this brush by going to Brush, Save As, and I'll save this as Insert Scales, and this brush will be saved and available for you to open up and experiment with. So now we'll switch over to the Skin Z-Sphere tail. This is just a Z-Sphere model that was created with multiple polygroups. And you'll notice that each face is relatively small, not too small, about the size that we want for each individual scale. Now, with our Insert Scales brush selected, I will go to Brush, and then I will select Create NanoMesh Brush. Make sure RGB is turned on, and I will go to White, Startup Material, turn on mRGB, and go to Color, Fill Object. And that fills the current object with a material and color. So now I'll just select one of my scales. We'll grab this one here, mouse over a face, press the space bar. We're inserting a NanoMesh, and I will do Polygroup Island. So it's going to insert scales just on this first segment of polygroups. So we'll draw those scales out. Now I will go to the NanoMesh menu, and you see because I have a material and color on my base object, and I have polypaint on my NanoMesh, or on my insert mesh, it picks that up in the NanoMesh. So under the NanoMesh controls, I will go to my rotation. Let's go to X rotation, and then we can add some rotation to these scales. And maybe we want to change the length of the scales, so we'll let them be a little bit longer so they sort of interdigitate like this. They've got a little bit of length to them and they overlap. Now, what I will do is I will click Copy. Now I've just copied the settings for that particular insert mesh. Now I'm going to grab the next scale, this one here, which has a different shape and coloration. Press the space bar. Once again, we're inserting NanoMesh on Polygroup Island. Click and drag, and that draws this scale out on this section. And I will click Paste, and it will paste those settings into this NanoMesh. So now it's maintaining uniformity with the previous NanoMesh. Now I want these to get a little bit smaller as we go down the length of the tail, so I'll turn these down, and I will copy that. Now let's go to our last scale here, click and drag, and I will paste again. So you see we've got 3 indexes now, 0, 1, and 2. This particular one I want to be a lot smaller, so I'm going to take my size and turn my size down on this. And let's turn our length up so they're a little bit longer. And let's change our rotation around the X. So let's do X rotation, and let's let these be a little bit tighter against one another like this. And maybe we'll bring that length down as well. Now I can change my scales once again. Go to the Polysphere 1 scale. That's my second scale. Click and drag to draw that in. Paste that on. And let's change the width this time. Let's go to width. Let's make these a little bit wider. Let's change our rotation. That's our Z offset. Let's go to our rotation here. We'll do our X rotation. Now, let's change our size. Let's go ahead and turn the sizing down on this one. Now, I could increase my scaling at this point just by going to my tiles and say do tile 2 by 2. And then I can change my size. And I can make these scales even smaller and tighter as we get further down the length of the tail. If I copy this and then let's do the smallest scale here at the very, very tip, we'll draw that on, paste, and now we've got the scales on the tip. And I can, of course, once again, change my rotation, change the X rotation. You can see we get this nice, almost looks like a armadillo. And we can change our length, so they're quite long at the tip. And there we go. We've created a sequence of scales running down the length of this object that we created using Z-spheres. Now, the benefit of using Z-spheres to make our base mesh is the edges will all point in the right direction. If you draw your scales and they're all pointing in the wrong direction, just go to Geometry, Modify Topology, and click Align Edge, and that will align the edges. If I were to spin the edges, you see that it spins the edges underlying these nanomeshes, so it changes the orientation or the direction of those nanomesh objects. Now, if we come down here in the, let's close the geometry menu, come back to the NanoMesh menu and go to Colorize. We're already picking up the RGB color from our NanoMesh. If I were to pick up a mesh MRGB, it picks up the color of the underlying mesh. So that's going to clear out the poly painting that I already have on my insert meshes. I can pick up just the color, or I can pick up just the material. So that is possible to pick up as well. I could also pick up the UI color and material. So if I had a different material selected in the UI, for example, droplet, I could pick that up by doing UI MRGB, UI color, or UI material. So if we go back to basic material 2, and if I changed my color, I could then pick up UI color, and that would pick up whatever color was selected in the user interface. Now, if I want to bake these down into actual geometry, once again, we go to Inventory and just click One to Mesh. One to Mesh. I have frame mode turned on, so I'll turn off polyframe. One to Mesh. So it goes through each one of these, and if I delete one, it will delete it. Delete all deletes all the remaining nanomeshes. I can undo that with Control-Z. So NanoMesh is really a powerful tool. It's something that I use quite a bit for things like feathers and scales. I use it to make bases for figures, flagstones, things that we demonstrated in this video. There's another neat thing that you can do with NanoMesh, which will approximate sort of a hard surface dynamics. And I'd like to show you that now using the ZBrush cloth dynamics that are new in ZBrush 2021. We can create a rigid body dynamic simulation using cloth in conjunction with NanoMesh. So let's take a look at that now. So here we have a polymesh star over the floor plane. Now I've got the floor plane locked to the ground by going to Draw and setting my elevation slider to 0. That way, if I move the poly star, the floor plane won't snap to it. I'm going to convert this into a polyplane, and I will just rotate this 90 degrees, scale it up, bring it down here to about the floor plane, and add a few subdivision levels. We're basically just going to make a ground plane with this. I'll take the standard brush, spray stroke, and a nice randomized alpha like alpha 8. Ooh, that's a bit strong. Let's turn down our Z intensity on that. And I just want to build a nice ground plane here. We'll add a couple more subdivision levels to that. And I'll bring this down just beneath the ground plane. So this will be our floor plane. Now I'm going to append another polymesh star. We'll take this polymesh star, we'll turn off solo mode so we can see everything, and I'll bring this up. I'll hit the gizmo gear, and I'm going to turn this into a polyplane. And if we turn on frame mode, we can see the resulting polygroups, or the resulting poly count. I'm pretty happy with that resolution. So we'll bring this up and scale this down. Now, I have a brush here in my brush menu. It's Insert Multi-Mesh Skull. So I'll just grab one of these skulls, go to Brush, Create NanoMesh Brush. Press the space bar. We're going to do Polygroup All, and I'm just going to click and drag, and this will drag a skull out into each one of these faces. Let's just grab this one here. Now let's go to our NanoMesh controls. Under NanoMesh, I'm going to change my Z rotation to 0. And let's actually change that to 90. Let's change it to 180. I just want them to be facing up at us. 360. There we go. Let's get them right there. So -90. There we go. Now, these are growing out of this polygon plane. I want to give this polygon plane some thickness because this is going to be a cloth object. And I want this cloth object to encase these skulls so I can use it as a collision object. So what I will do is I will go to Geometry, Dynamic Subdivision, turn on Dynamic, and then I'm going to turn thickness up so we get a nice thick mesh here. Now, the point of this is I want these skulls to sit inside of this volume. I want them to be encased by this cloth object. So what I will do is I'll go back to my NanoMesh controls and go to my Z offset and just make sure that these are sitting inside. Maybe we'll turn the size down just a little bit. There we go. Now, if I'm not happy with them sitting on the outside, I can press Shift-D to turn off that polygroup, or that dynamic subdivision, and I can add a polygroup just by Control-Shift-clicking and dragging. Press the space bar, and I can move this marquee around, and I will just isolate this group here. Then I will invert my visibility, go to Polygroups, Group Visible. And there we go. So you see that they disappear off that outer polygroup. Now I'll go ahead and press D to turn my thickness back on, and those skulls are now sitting inside. If I go back to my dynamic subdivision levels here, go to Geometry, Dynamic Subdivision Thickness, we can dial this back. And they don't have to be completely inside, but as close as possible will be helpful. Now, what I will do is take my smart subdivisions and turn this down so I don't actually have any subdivision levels, I just have the thickness. Make sure that I can see my ground plane here. What I will do is I will take this object and I'm just going to give it a little bit of a rotation, bring it down a little bit closer to the floor plane so it doesn't have quite so far to fall. We're going to run a dynamic simulation on this object with these nanomeshes attached to it. So let's go ahead and do that now. If I were to go to NanoMesh and turn off Show Placement, I won't have to actually see the placement of the objects. But for that to actually work, I would have to bake in these dynamic subdivisions. So I'll go to Geometry. Let's apply our dynamic subdivisions. I'm going to turn off Post Subdiv and click Apply. There we go. And go back to our NanoMesh. Make sure that our depth stays consistent. So Z offset, let's bring these back. And let's put some randomness in here. Let's change our rotation. Let's give some randomness to the rotation. Let's change the randomness of the Z depth. And let's give it some X rotation and some randomness. If I turn off Show Placement, you can see that we just see the skulls, but we are going to see the outermost polygroup. Now, I could delete that polygroup and not have to actually see it at all, but we're going to delete this geometry as it is. So let's go ahead now and run our simulation. So we'll go to the Dynamics menu, tear this off, and I am going to make sure gravity is turned on. I'm going to take self-collision and turn this probably all the way up, 3 or 4 at least, because I do not want the cloth to collide on itself. That will keep the skulls from interpenetrating. That's why they're sitting inside of this volume. Now I will turn on collision volume, and that's going to figure in the ground plane and that sort of terrain I created. Now if I run simulation, it's going to take this cloth object and it's going to collapse it down onto that ground plane. Now you can see that that is creating sort of a pile of skulls. We'll give this a moment to actually finish working. Now I can click on the background if I like. Maybe I want to change my orientation here. If I bring this up and go to B for brush, T for transpose, and select transpose cloth, I can now use this transpose gizmo with dynamics. So I can sort of knock this down like this. And you see it's creating this nice little pile here. If I rotate it like this, I can make that compress against the ground plane like so. I can knock it down this way, and you can see that it's basically compressing these skulls together. Let's go ahead and turn off that terrain so you can see it happening a little bit better. See, as I compress it against the ground, the skulls react. So let's bring this up, and then let's run our simulation again. And you see they collapse down against the ground, and it's quite a thick bit of cloth here. So they're only going to be able to fall so much. So what I will do now is turn off my simulation, and let's turn the cloth firmness down. And let's once again run our simulation. Now that cloth is going to be a lot softer. You see how it's reacting to the surface underneath. Just click on the background or press the space bar and you can turn off the simulation. And then we can just take our dynamic brush and sort of slap this down. So as you see, it's figuring in that underlying terrain as well. So let's go ahead back to our NanoMesh. I am going to duplicate this. Bring this one up. Let's select our NanoMesh down here on the ground. Let's go to our NanoMesh settings, and we will say 1 to mesh. And then I will Control-Shift-Click on the polygroups. Let's turn off frame mode so we can actually see our skulls. Control-Shift-Click on the polygroups here. Let's get rid of those faces that we grew these out of. And then I can go to Geometry, Modify Topology. Delete Hidden. Clear the masking. We've got a nice little pile of skulls there. And so we can add to that if we want to then factor this dynamic object in as well. Let's go back up here. Let's select our other dynamic object. This is still a NanoMesh. I can rotate this around. And were I to add a division to this, it's going to make those skulls smaller. It will increase the number of skulls, but will also make them smaller. So be aware of that. Let's bring this down. And then we can make this interact with that surface as well. Now let's recalculate. So that recalculates the collision volumes. And then I'll just continue to sort of knock this down against the ground plane using the cloth transpose. There we go. So you see as I pull it down under the ground, they just start to bounce along it and they'll interact with all the other objects. So let's go ahead and run our simulation and let those fall against the other skulls. And they'll just naturally find their place. So we can end our simulation. And let's go into frame mode, Shift F, and I'm going to turn off lines so we don't actually see the poly lines, we just see the color coding. And I will go to NanoMesh, and I will click under Inventory, 1 to Mesh. Now that makes these actual objects. And then I will just Control-Shift-Click on these skulls. I'll just switch out of the cloth brush, Control-Shift-Click on the skulls, invert my visibility, and that gives me just the cloth, and I can go back to geometry, modify topology, delete hidden. And there we go. Let's turn off frame mode with Shift F. Now you see we've created this nice little pile of skulls here using dynamics. Now I can, because these are all separate pieces of geometry, I can manipulate these independently. If I go to polygroups, auto group, it will automatically group each skull separately. So if I were to go to Shift F, you see each skull now has a separate polygroup. If I alt click on this subtool, and once again auto group, these will get their own separate subtools. Now, because those teeth are separate, it's also going to polygroup those teeth separately as well. So you want to be aware of that. Perhaps you, when you create your NanoMesh, want to make sure that the teeth are part of the same mesh. So what we can do now is, let's go ahead and isolate, Control-Shift-Click on this skull, and let's isolate those teeth. And then we can mask everyone else by Control-Clicking on the background, Control-Shift-Click to reveal that skull again. And then I can just take Transpose. Make sure I switch back to the normal Transpose. We're on Transpose Cloth right now, so I'll go to Transpose, go to the Unmasked Mesh Center, and then I can just manually position the skull however I want. Maybe I want to scoot this over here, give it a little bit of a rotation, bring it down. It's quite similar to using dynamics in Maya to create junk piles or, randomized groupings of objects. It's much, much easier to do these things, getting a start in these things with dynamics, than it is to sort of manually place 100 skulls. So here we've got a nice kind of pile of skulls that we can use as part of a backdrop or a base for a figure. So we zoom out from there. There we go. And we can do as many of these as we want. As you saw, we duplicated 2 instances of this NanoMesh cloth to make this pile of skulls. We could continue putting more and more of them out on the ground to make it even more randomized, changing the NanoMesh settings as we go to introduce more variation. So I find that to be a really cool use of cloth dynamics with NanoMesh. So we can combine 2 ZBrush tools to allow ZBrush to do what is essentially rigid body dynamics by simply using cloth dynamics. So that completes this look at NanoMesh. If you want to learn more about cloth, we have a whole video where we talk about the cloth tools in depth. This was just a touch on it, just so we could see how we could use it in conjunction with NanoMesh. NanoMesh works very well in conjunction with Array Mesh as well, which we also have another video that details. You may be watching these videos out of order, so I always try and mention when there are other videos that I recommend that you take a look at that you might not have seen up to this stage. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.